April 7th, 1945. South of the Japanese mainland, the waters of the East China Sea rolled in gray, heavy swells. Through the mist, a shape emerged, vast, dark, and almost mythic. It was the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, pushing through the waves on what all aboard knew might be her final journey. At 72,000 tons, she was not merely a vessel, she was the embodiment of Japan's naval pride. The thunder of her great 18.1-inch guns meant to terrify enemies and shield an empire. But on this morning, those massive turrets stood silent. Their barrels, longer than a railroad car, tracked the empty horizon as if waiting for a foe they would never reach. Below decks, deep within her armored belly, stokers shoveled and sweated, feeding her vast boilers with the last reserves of precious fuel. Each ton of oil pushed the Leviathan only a few miles closer to Okinawa, where her destiny awaited. On her decks, young sailors, many barely out of their teens, clutched rifles and scanned the skies. They were not trained aviators, nor seasoned anti-air gunners. They were farm boys and factory hands pressed into service aboard the pride of the fleet. Some whispered prayers into the cold sea wind. Others fixed their eyes on the horizon, willing the gray distance to stay empty a little longer. Yet all of them knew the truth. Yamato's mission was not to return. Operation 10 Go, as the Imperial Navy called it, was a one-way sortie. She would sail toward Okinawa, beach herself if necessary, and fight until destroyed. It was sacrifice dressed as strategy, and her crew understood. The great ship was moving not toward victory, but toward death. Above them, unseen but inevitable, the hunters were already gathering. From the decks of more than a dozen American aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes had begun to rise into the morning sky. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, an iron storm, moving fast, moving inexorably toward the giant below. On Yamato's bridge, officers watched their radar screens flicker. At first, faint contacts, then more, then dozens. A formation of dots sweeping closer, tightening like a noose. Below, the intercom buzzed and crackled with reports. Gun crews manning stations, engines pushing harder, damage control parties ready for the inevitable. The men on deck could now hear it, the distant rumble of engines across the sky, like the growl of some vast approaching storm. The trap had been sprung. The hunters had found their prey. And so began the last voyage of Yamato, a journey into fire, steel, and legend. In the late 1930s, as the clouds of war thickened over the Pacific, Japan's naval architects pursued a vision both audacious and desperate. They knew the United States could outbuild them in every category of ship, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, but they clung to one belief. If they could build a battleship so massive, so powerful, that it could defeat any number of opponents in a single engagement, they might tip the balance. From this calculation was born Yamato. Her design was undertaken in absolute secrecy. At the Kure Naval Arsenal, immense scaffolding rose under towering canvas screens, concealing the vastness of what was taking shape within. Even Japanese citizens living nearby could only guess at the colossus being assembled behind tarps and guards. Engineers pored over blueprints that pushed the limits of metallurgy, propulsion, and gunnery. The goal was clear: produce a vessel that no American battleship could match, a floating fortress immune to anything afloat. And so she took shape. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, she would be the heaviest warship ever constructed. Her main battery, 9 18.1-inch guns, were unlike anything the world had seen, capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles. Each shell was the size of a small car, able to smash through thick armor and obliterate anything in its path. Her protective belt reached nearly 16 inches of hardened steel. Deck armor was layered so heavily that naval officers boasted she could shrug off any shell fired by an American or British ship. Yet the irony of her creation was cruel. Even as the first plates of her hull were welded into place, the aircraft carrier was beginning to rewrite the laws of naval war. In 1939 and 1940, Japanese strategists still believed the decisive clash of battle lines would decide the Pacific. They imagined Yamato at the head of such a fleet, her guns roaring, her armor unbroken, annihilating the enemy with brute strength. But technology was moving faster than tradition. Carriers and aircraft were already proving that steel walls and massive guns could be bypassed by bombs dropped from above or torpedoes sliding in beneath the armor belt. Yamato represented both the peak of battleship design and its last gasp. Still, in those early years, as her immense hull slid down the ways at Kure, she stood as a triumph of engineering and ambition, a beast of steel and firepower, conceived in secrecy, raised in pride, destined for legend and for tragedy. As Japan poured precious resources into one leviathan of steel, across the Pacific, a very different strategy was taking shape. The United States, blessed with vast natural resources and an industrial base unlike any in history, chose not to gamble on a single giant. Instead, America embraced mass production, the relentless turning of assembly lines into fleets. By 1942, while Yamato prowled the inland sea, American factories were already producing aircraft carriers at a pace that astonished friend and foe alike. The Essex-class carrier, displacing 27,000 tons, rolled out of yards in Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia with assembly line regularity. Where Japan struggled to conceal a single battleship, the United States launched carrier after carrier. By war's end, nearly 24 Essex-class vessels alone. This was the arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin Roosevelt called it. Detroit produced tanks by day, bombers by night. Pittsburgh's steel mills burned ceaselessly, forging the armor plates of destroyers, cruisers, and carriers. Even civilian industries were transformed. Automobile plants became aircraft factories. Refrigerator companies built machine guns. At its peak, American shipyards could deliver a fully equipped escort carrier in less than 3 months. And with each carrier came air groups bristling with power. F-6F Hellcats, rugged and reliable, became the Navy's airborne shield. SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, ungainly but deadly, could punch through decks with armor-piercing bombs. And the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, slow, lumbering, yet tenacious, proved itself capable of sinking giants. Where Japan sought invincibility in a single hull, America sought superiority in overwhelming numbers. It was a contest of philosophies as much as of steel. The battleship embodied the old order, strength through size, dominance through armor. The carrier embodied the new, mobility, reach, and air power as the decisive hand of war. By 1945, the outcome of that contest was clear. Against the weight of American industry, Yamato was not merely outmatched. She was already obsolete, a behemoth built for an age that had passed. By the spring of 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing. American Marines and soldiers had stormed ashore at Okinawa, just 350 miles from the home islands. If Okinawa fell, Japan itself would lie exposed. Desperation gripped the Imperial Navy, and in that desperation came one final, fateful order. The mission was codenamed Operation 10 Go. Its plan was simple, brutal, and doomed. The battleship Yamato, escorted by 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers, would steam south toward Okinawa. She carried just enough fuel for a one-way voyage. Once there, she was to beach herself and become a stationary fortress, her massive guns thundering against the American invasion fleet until she was destroyed. On April 6th, the order was given. Crews were briefed. Officers told their men to write final letters home. Every sailor aboard understood there would be no return. To many, the mission was portrayed as an honorable sacrifice for the emperor, the ultimate gesture of loyalty. In reality, it was a measure of Japan's desperation, a gamble born not of hope, but of inevitability. That afternoon, the mighty Yamato slipped her moorings in the inland sea. At her side sailed the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, their decks crowded with young men staring out at the fading coastline of Japan. Engines roared, smoke poured from funnels, and the task force turned south into the open waters of the East China Sea. But secrecy was impossible. Within hours, American submarines spotted the formation and shadowed it. By nightfall, Reconnaissance aircraft were circling above, relaying the news to Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The American response was swift and overwhelming. Task Force 58, more than a dozen carriers, supported by battleships and cruisers, was ordered to intercept. A storm of steel and fire was already being prepared. From the flight decks of the carriers Essex, Intrepid, Yorktown, and others, mechanics readied squadrons of Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers. Fuel tanks were topped off, bombs armed, torpedoes loaded. Pilots were briefed with a clarity that left no doubt. The target was the largest battleship in the world. Meanwhile, aboard Yamato, tension built with each passing hour. Officers paced the bridge. Gunners checked their weapons again and again, knowing the sky would soon be filled with enemies. Damage control teams drilled in the dim light of the ship's belly. And on the horizon, the first flickers of dawn began to break, a dawn that would lead them to annihilation. Morning, April 7th, 1945. The sea lay gray and restless beneath a ceiling of broken cloud. On the horizon, Yamato and her escorts pressed southward, their bows carving white scars into the water. Above them, silence. Then, faintly, the sound that every man feared. Engines. At 10 o'clock a.m., the first American squadrons arrived. From the east, dark specks appeared against the pale sky, growing swiftly larger. Avenger torpedo bombers flying low, Helldivers higher above, their wings bristling with bombs, and Hellcats sweeping in escort. Dozens of them, then hundreds, filling the heavens with the relentless hum of war. Alarms shrieked aboard Yamato. Gunners swung into action, traversing barrels skyward. Ammunition crews hauled shells into position, sweat mixing with grease and smoke. The ship's massive anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, spewing streams of tracer that clawed into the sky. Black blossoms of flak burst among the American formations. The air shook with thunder. The first Avengers came in low, skimming the waves. From their bellies dropped silver torpedoes, slicing the sea with deadly wakes as they streaked toward the behemoth. Yamato heeled hard to starboard, her giant hull groaning as water foamed at her bow. Some torpedoes passed harmlessly astern. Others struck. The first impact shook the ship like an earthquake, a muffled roar deep below decks, followed by the sickening roll of steel and water rushing in. Above, Helldivers screamed down almost vertically, their dive sirens wailing. Bombs fell, whistling, then detonating with geysers of flame and spray across the decks. One explosion tore through the superstructure, killing dozens of anti-aircraft gunners in an instant. Still, the ship fought back. Gun crews, choking on smoke, reloaded and fired again, sending a curtain of lead skyward. Several American planes were torn apart, their flaming wrecks plunging into the sea. For the men aboard Yamato, time dissolved into chaos. The deck shuddered with every impact. The sky boiled with smoke and tracers, and everywhere came the cries of the wounded. Yet the Leviathan still moved forward, her engines roaring, her flag still flying. To the American pilots circling above, it was like striking a mountain. The giant ship seemed to absorb punishment and keep on going, her armored hide shrugging off what would have sunk lesser vessels. But the first cracks had appeared. Compartments flooded. Fire spread. The battle had begun in earnest, and it would not end until the giant lay beneath the waves. The first attack had bloodied the Leviathan. Now the hunters returned to finish the kill. Shortly after noon, the second American wave descended. From the decks of Essex, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, and other carriers, more than 100 aircraft screamed into the skies. They came in disciplined waves, fighters first, then dive bombers, then torpedo planes, each element designed to pin down Yamato and deliver the coup de grace. The Japanese gunners fought with desperation. Anti-aircraft batteries rattled and roared, throwing up walls of tracer fire. The sky shimmered with black smoke bursts, fragments whistling back onto the decks below. Yet the American pilots pressed on, undeterred. They had trained for this moment, and their quarry could not escape. The first torpedoes of this new assault struck Yamato's port side. Each explosion hammered her hull, ripping open steel and flooding compartments. The ship lurched, listing several degrees to port. Pumps roared to life, and damage control teams swarmed into action, sealing hatches, shoring bulkheads, battling floods with frantic energy. Men worked in darkness, ankle-deep in seawater, choking on fumes, driven by the knowledge that their survival depended on each compartment holding just a little longer. But the onslaught did not relent. From above, helldivers plunged in again, their bombs finding the decks with sickening precision. One tore into the forward turret structure, wrecking gunnery controls. Another smashed into the bridge, killing officers in a storm of fire and splinters. Smoke poured skyward, flames licking at the mast and engulfing crewmen who had no place to run. By 1 p.m., Yamato was staggering. Her list increased as more torpedoes tore into her port side. Steering grew sluggish, her great rudders barely answering commands. Yet still she fought. Her remaining anti-aircraft crews, deafened by blasts, eyes burning from smoke, continued to fire upward until bombs and strafing runs cut them down. The third wave delivered the mortal wound. Avengers, flying so low they seemed to skim the waves, dropped torpedoes in perfect sequence, each aimed to strike the same vulnerable side. The impacts came like sledgehammers, one after another, overwhelming the ship's ability to stay afloat. Water rushed in unchecked. The list grew catastrophic. Below decks, chaos reigned. Darkness swallowed compartments as power failed. Flooding surged through corridors, trapping men behind watertight doors that could no longer be opened. Some prayed. Some hammered at the steel until the rising water silenced them. Above, officers issued final orders. Save the ship, or failing that, save the honor of the crew. At 2:20 p.m., the inevitable came. Yamato rolled heavily to port, her massive turrets swinging like pendulums as water consumed her. Seconds later, a cataclysmic explosion tore her apart. Her magazines, thousands of tons of shells and propellant, detonated in a single titanic blast. A column of fire and smoke erupted 5 miles into the sky. The shockwave rippled across the sea, felt even by distant American ships. Pilots circling above gasped at the scale of the eruption. Some said it looked as though a volcano had burst from the ocean floor. When the smoke cleared, the greatest battleship ever built was gone. Nearly 3,000 souls gone with her. Only a few hundred clung to wreckage and oil-slicked waters, awaiting rescue or death. The era of the battleship had ended, not with a duel of giants, but with a rain of steel from the sky. For all the scale of steel and fire, war is ultimately measured in human lives. When Yamato rolled and exploded, nearly 3,000 men vanished into the sea. Only about 280 survived, scattered across wreckage and oil-slicked waves. Their voices, carried across the decades, reveal the terror, sacrifice, and futility of that final day. Survivors described the chaos below decks as the torpedoes struck. Darkness fell, corridors flooded, and men clawed desperately at sealed hatches. "We could hear our comrades pounding from the other side," one sailor recalled. But the water rose too fast. Their voices grew weaker, then were gone. Others clung to ladders in pitch blackness as seawater surged upward, swallowing compartments one by one. On deck, gunners fought until the very end. Survivors remembered comrades standing at their stations even as flames licked around them, refusing to abandon their posts. One young sailor, badly burned, was seen saluting as the ship listed, his body swallowed moments later by the sea. For the Americans in the air, the memory carried a different weight. Pilots spoke of the adrenaline rush, the blinding flak, the thrill of striking the largest battleship ever built. Yet many also carried a sense of sorrow. Commander James Varenis, circling after releasing his bombs, later said, "She was a magnificent ship. To see her die was like watching a great beast brought down. We cheered, but inside some of us felt only sadness." Among the Japanese survivors, letters written before departure spoke volumes. Many men had left behind farewell notes to parents and wives, some expressing pride in their final mission, others confessing fear they dared not voice aloud. Those fragments, found later, remind us that behind every uniform was a son, a brother, a husband. In the end, Yamato's wreckage sank into silence, but the human stories endured, of courage, of tragedy, of lives consumed by a war rushing to its bitter close. For the Americans who fought that day, the sinking of Yamato was more than a tactical victory. It was a moment heavy with symbolism, and one that stirred mixed emotions among those who witnessed it. Pilots who had attacked the ship spoke of awe as much as triumph. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey, an Avenger pilot, later recalled, "It was like attacking a mountain. You hit her again, and still she came on. When she finally rolled, we knew we had destroyed something extraordinary." To the men in the air, the sight of the world's largest battleship capsizing beneath their bombs was proof that their doctrine of carrier air power was unassailable. On the bridges of American carriers, admirals watched the reports flow in. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher received word of the explosion at 2:23 p.m. and understood instantly that the age of the battleship had ended. In his eyes, the battle validated everything the U.S. Navy had embraced since Pearl Harbor, that steel giants, no matter how powerful, were helpless without air cover. Yet not all reflections were triumphant. Some pilots admitted unease at the orders that followed. American aircraft strafed survivors in the water, fearing they might attempt suicide attacks or be rescued to fight another day. "It was war," one pilot said, "but I can still see the faces in that sea of oil." For many sailors, the destruction of Yamato felt like both justice and tragedy. Justice for Pearl Harbor, for the long road across the Pacific, for comrades lost in earlier battles. Tragedy because the men aboard her were not so different from themselves, young, frightened, swept into a struggle larger than any individual. In the end, the Americans saw in Yamato's destruction both vindication and warning. Vindication that their carriers reigned supreme. Warning that even the mightiest symbols of power could vanish in a single afternoon of fire. The thunder of Yamato's death did not simply mark the end of a ship. It marked the end of an idea. For centuries, naval power had been measured in tons of steel and the caliber of guns. The battleship was not merely a weapon. It was a symbol of national pride, a floating fortress meant to embody the power of a nation. Yet on April 7th, 1945, the skies above Okinawa revealed a new truth. No matter how vast, no matter how armored, no battleship could withstand the storm of aircraft unleashed by a carrier fleet. The lesson had been foreshadowed years before. At Taranto in 1940, British carrier planes had crippled the Italian battle fleet in a single night. At Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japanese torpedo bombers had proved the vulnerability of America's own battleships. Again and again, air power demonstrated that range and mobility had surpassed armor and gunnery. But some still clung to the old doctrine, insisting that a clash of steel leviathans would one day decide the war. The destruction of Yamato swept away that illusion forever. Strategically, the battle highlighted the irreconcilable philosophies of Japan and the United States. The Imperial Navy had invested years of resources, secrecy, and manpower into a single vessel, hoping it would act as a counterbalance to American industry. Yet the Americans had chosen the opposite path. Dozens of carriers, each flexible, each capable of projecting power far beyond the horizon. Where Japan sought to build one invincible giant, America built 1,000 lethal blades. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. By the spring of 1945, the United States possessed nearly 90 aircraft carriers of all types, fleet, light, and escort, while Japan could field only a handful, many of them crippled or without trained pilots. The Americans had produced more than 60,000 naval aircraft. Japan, by comparison, could not even fully equip the Yamato's task force with adequate air cover. The result was inevitable. No battleship, no matter how mighty, could fight an air fleet alone. Yet the significance of Yamato's loss extended beyond the tactical. It struck at the very heart of Japanese strategy. Ever since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05, the Japanese Navy had envisioned a decisive fleet battle, a single titanic clash that would determine control of the seas. Yamato was the weapon built for that battle. Her 9 18.1-inch guns could fire shells weighing as much as a small car, capable of annihilating any American battleship in a duel. Her armor was designed to withstand the heaviest hits, but that decisive battle never came. Instead, war in the Pacific unfolded as a contest of islands and airfields, of amphibious invasions and carrier strikes. By the time Yamato finally left port for Okinawa, the world had passed her by. To American commanders, her destruction was proof that their doctrine was correct. Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz had long argued that carriers were the future, that mobility and reach outweighed tonnage and armor. At Okinawa, their faith was vindicated beyond doubt. For the cost of 10 planes and 12 American airmen, Task Force 58 had sunk the most powerful battleship ever constructed. But the lesson was not without nuance. Some historians argue that Yamato was doomed less by the inherent weakness of battleships and more by the circumstances of her sortie. She had no air cover, no meaningful escort, and sailed with only enough fuel for a one-way journey. Against a balanced fleet, perhaps her survival might have lasted longer. Yet the larger truth remains. Even the most formidable battleship required carrier protection to operate in a world ruled by air power. Without it, she was a target. The psychological impact of her sinking was profound. In Japan, Yamato had been more than a warship. She was a national symbol, a floating embodiment of strength and sacrifice. Her loss sent shockwaves through the Navy and the public. To many Japanese, it felt like the nation itself was slipping beneath the waves. To the Americans, the sinking was a harbinger of victory, proof that the enemy's last weapons could not halt the relentless advance. In the broader sweep of naval history, the death of Yamato closed the chapter on the battleship era. No navy would ever again build a vessel of such size and armament. After 1945, aircraft carriers became the undisputed queens of the sea. Every major naval power shifted resources into carrier fleets, and the doctrine of sea power was rewritten. Even today, nearly 80 years later, navies project strength not through heavy guns, but through flight decks. And yet, Yamato endures in memory, precisely because of her failure. She is remembered as the last gasp of an old idea, a steel monument to a vanished age. Her story illustrates the tension between tradition and innovation, between the pride of nations and the cold arithmetic of war. She was built to dominate by brute force, yet she fell to the agile strike of air power. In that contrast lies the strategic lesson of her end. The future belongs not to the biggest, but to the most adaptable. As the smoke cleared over the East China Sea that April afternoon, the world understood what the sailors of Yamato already knew. Size alone could no longer command the oceans. The decisive weapon of the future was not the gun, but the aircraft and the carrier that carried it. When the waters of the East China Sea settled on April 7, 1945, the wreck of Yamato slipped beneath the waves, taking with her nearly 3,000 souls. The explosion that consumed her could be seen more than 100 miles away, but the echoes of her loss reverberated far longer. For Japan, for the world, and for the future of naval warfare, her destruction symbolized the closing of an age. In Japan, Yamato had never been simply a warship. She was a national myth made steel. Her very name evoked the ancient Yamato province, the spiritual heart of the Japanese people. To many, she embodied the strength and sacrifice of a nation fighting against impossible odds. Her end was not only a military defeat, but also a cultural wound. Survivors who staggered ashore described not only grief for fallen comrades, but also shame at the loss of a vessel they believed invincible. In post-war Japan, her memory transformed. What once symbolized might came to stand for tragedy, for the futility of sacrifice in a war already lost. For the United States, Yamato's destruction was confirmation of the strategic path it had chosen. Carrier power had triumphed completely. The doctrine that had guided admirals like Nimitz and Mitscher was validated in spectacular fashion. The greatest battleship in history had fallen to waves of aircraft, not to another ship's guns. For the American people, the victory was a reminder of industrial supremacy. A nation that could build carriers faster than Japan could replace losses, that could train pilots by the thousands and fuel their fleets across oceans. The message was unmistakable. No fortress of steel could withstand the storm of democracy's arsenal. Yet beyond strategy, the story of Yamato lingers, because it is more than a tale of weapons. It is the story of men. Sailors who boarded her knowing they would not return. Pilots who risked flak and fire to strike a target that seemed indestructible. Families on both sides who waited for letters that would never come. In that human dimension, Yamato's fate transcends statistics of tonnage and caliber. It becomes a meditation on the cost of pride, the limits of technology, and the inexorable tide of history. Naval historians often debate what lessons her destruction holds. Some see her as an anachronism, proof that Japan had misjudged the future by clinging to the battleship ideal long after it was obsolete. Others argue that she represented the natural culmination of centuries of naval thought, that only through her fall could the world accept that the era of armor and gunnery had ended. Whatever the interpretation, the consensus remains. Yamato was the last and greatest of her kind. No navy has ever again built a ship to rival her guns or her armor. In the decades since, her memory has been preserved not only in archives and war colleges, but also in popular imagination. Films, novels, and memorials have transformed her into both legend and cautionary tale. In Kure, where she was built in secrecy, a museum now stands, honoring those who served aboard her and preserving fragments of the ship recovered from the seabed. Visitors walk her reconstructed bridge and gaze at models of her great guns, reminded of both her grandeur and her futility. The philosophical reflection her story inspires is timeless. Technology, no matter how advanced, cannot overcome the imbalance of scale when nations collide. Courage, no matter how fierce, cannot reverse the tide of industrial might. In Yamato, we see the clash between pride and pragmatism, between tradition and innovation. She was the strongest battleship ever built, and yet her life was brief, her victories few, her end catastrophic. But there is also dignity in her memory. For the men who sailed with her, the ship was home, the center of their service and sacrifice. Their story reminds us that even in doomed missions, human courage endures. The lesson of Yamato is not only that carriers defeated battleships, but that war consumes the best efforts of men and machines alike, leaving behind silence and memory. As the last bubbles of her death rose on that April afternoon, the age of the battleship ended. The future belonged to the carrier, the submarine, and eventually to weapons beyond imagination. Yet in the depths of the East China Sea rests a monument to another time, a colossal relic of steel and ambition. Yamato's legacy is twofold: the awe of what human hands can build, and the sorrow of how swiftly war can destroy it. In her rise, we see the pride of a nation. In her fall, we see the inevitability of change. And in her memory, we find a question that echoes across the years. Is greatness measured by strength, or by the lessons left behind when strength fails?